sort of a rule of thumb of where you've seen the most effective timing of team meetings, or is it really specific per project? In other words, is there a rule of thumb twice a month? What's been the best model today?
Well, I'll just say from a personal point, having done a lot of projects, I like to start with weekly meetings because you have to kind of assess, how efficient the team's going to be at getting tasks done, and it's better to kind of start with more frequent meetings. You can always drop back to every other week or whatever. But if you're not meeting at least once a month, you're not going to get a chance to know your other team members. I mean, that's pretty true. So it will depend on kind of the scope of your project and how much work has been defined. And, of course, as Manisha pointed out, that changes all the time. So feel free to evaluate and change things. There's one project where people were kind of grumbling about meeting every week, and then in the end we really enjoyed meeting every week, so we just kept doing it.
Even after the project finished.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
What kind of commitment are you looking for from the various members of the team in terms of hours per week or a month or however you think about it?
Well, we have an official answer there.
10 to 15 hours a month.
But I mean, in terms of what happens in the project.
It so depends on where you are in the project. That is something that really varies. There will be times when you're not doing that much on a weekly basis, and then there'll be weeks where, especially when you're conducting interviews, for example, which has happened in 2 or 3 cases I've been on, where you're talking to 3 or 4 people a week. And but then you'll have, generally there will be a time when you'll be able to relax a little more. Or the other thing that happens is when people sort of take vacations, that's almost a natural break. So for that couple of weeks, 3 members will be really active, or 4 will be, and a couple will be off, on vacation or whatever. So that gives you some thing. But it does vary a lot. It can vary a fair amount.
There are going to be points in the project where there'll be lulls in the project, and there'll be points of, kind of more intense work generally, before the final presentation. But the reason to have regular team meetings is I find, perhaps not surprisingly, that almost all the work gets done like the day before your next project meeting. So if you have regular meetings, the nice thing about that is you kind of space the work out, and you get people in a habit of just setting aside a couple of hours to focus on the project, and that kind of keeps it going at a regular pace, and it prevents the 80-hour all-nighter at the end.
And another thing I'd add is same vein, because of the kind of having regular meetings, it'd be nice if you think in your mind that you want to set aside at least an hour a week. So that gives up some meeting time at least. If nothing else, it's the meeting time. So that would be a minimum that you'd like to think about.
Questions for the panel or for me?
A constant theme that ran through this was the funding for nonprofits, whether it's a small one with a great idea or somebody with a lot of passion to do it, but they often don't know how to raise money. There's certainly standard fundraising, but what about knowledge on your teams about how to apply for grants? It's not something you learn a lot about in business school.
Well, I just say when clients come to us and are looking for assistance with development and fundraising, that's the one thing we don't do. Okay. We say no. They try to get around that often by marketing, business plans. But the thing I say to the clients is, we are MBA graduates. We are, by and large, not the best people to be helping you in that area. I mean, we do not have grant writers generally in our alumni base. That's a very specialized area of consulting. It's pretty much impossible to get it done pro bono.
Yeah,
and
it's very easy to get that expertise. There are all kinds of resources for training people on that, so
right.
That's not hard. But I would point out that many of you will be approached about going on the boards. At that point, if you don't have fundraising expertise, you'll need to get some training.
To your point, you said that fundraising seems to be a theme. I think what turns out is, because they're nonprofits, they actually do know how to do fundraising. They just want to do too much with that little pool of fundraising that they have. And that's where we can really help. Tell them that, you cannot do A to Z, you can manage A through F and help them pick that A through F. That's what I found more often to be the case, where they do have grant writers or they have done fundraising. It's with the deciding what's the scope of what they can do with that amount that we can really help with.
How do you deal with contentious political environment, and how much do you need to take that into your recommendation to the board of what can get done, or what they can get done?
One of the wonderful things I think about an ACT team is that you really are there to give them the best possible advice that you can. And while you may want to be sensitive to that in the way that you put it forward, you're there to be as candid as you possibly can be with those people. And I would not compromise your best thinking because of the politics.
And there are ways to do it in a sensitive way. I call it, I always have a slide at the end of my presentation called food for thought. And that's like, things you didn't ask us for, but we're going to tell you anyway. And so you kind of prep them for it, and it's like, these are just observations we made. We've been working with your organization for 6 months now, and we've had the opportunity to observe you in action, and we know we're not there on a day-to-day basis, but, food for thought, and then they will usually, hopefully they do something with it. They may not, but you've said your piece, and it's up to them to do something.
Sometimes you have to be a little Machiavellian in terms of, when situations where your advice might include having someone fired, or that it would be better if this person wasn't part of the organization. Then you have to figure out, one, is it realistic? Is there someone who's in a position of power who would be willing to listen to you and, who would make that happen? And of course, you only do that if you really think that is the solution to the problem. There's been one case where our team came up with that. It was very obvious one person needed to leave the team. And you may have to kind of use a side avenue to approach. And you give more direct, candid feedback to that person. And then when you're presenting to the board, you couch it more in terms of, there are organizational misalignments, and there are cultural differences. And, sometimes, that's how you kind of couch it. But we felt quite strongly that was the best advice we could give them.
Team leaders, if there are any issues that you've seen that are specific to students, or anything we should think about?
Actually, I think it's so great that students are on these teams, because that was not the case until relatively recently. And I'm also tremendously impressed with how organized you are and all the materials that you have in place. And if you're actually popping for dinner, this is a world that I have not experienced.
We like to hear that, David. Thank you.
I've had a number of students on my teams, and I know there are a lot of students here today, and I think that's great that you're willing to take that on in addition to all the other responsibilities of being a full-time student. What I say to other project leaders is that, be aware that, remember what it was like when you were at the GSB, when you thought all those classes really mattered. So and I try telling my students that, but they just don't believe me. So yeah, they're going to disappear when midterms come up. They're going to disappear when finals come up. Big project, So be realistic about kind of what you can expect from the students on your team. And on the other hand, I've had situations where students were the best contributors on the team. So don't underestimate them either. But, they're there to learn and to interact with the other alums on the team. So give them that opportunity. I remember on our last project, we were coaching one of our fac students on presentation skills, because she had not been in a role before, didn't have much career experience. So all of us were, giving her some preparation for some big final presentation she was doing in a class. And, so there's lots of, I think it adds a different flavor to the teams, and I think it's mostly positive. So, but, the students will kind of get as much out of it as they put into it. So.
At least like for you, it would be really good to talk to other students who've done it in the past 1 or 2 years. I'm sure you've done that, but that's probably the best thing that you can do for your information.
And we all know that many students are coming to the GSB with a wealth of experience, and so I would think maybe for the team leaders, try to call on that aspect of what they've done, because they probably have a lot to offer in that realm. Very rarely do we see people come directly to the GSB out of undergrad.
There's one more question over here. Okay. You get the last question.
Just wondering if an office has access to some legal advice, for instance, NDA issue ever?
Funny you should ask. I'm dealing with an NDA right now, a non-disclosure agreement. We use the University General Counsel for legal advice. We have a release form that they developed. So when I had this client and team decide they needed a non-disclosure agreement, I'm passing it back to the University General Counsel so they can look at it with our release form. So we do not have any, there's not a lawyer at the GSB, so we have to use the university, and I really hope most projects do not need that type of thing. But we do have access to that.
I would try to find out what it is that they're worried about and see if you can make your commitment to not disclose that one thing, which is probably a small part of the overall thing, and maybe then you don't have to involve lawyers.
Yeah, well, thank you for all the questions. On that subject, let me just mention that one of the questions that comes up is when you produce this output, your final report, what happens to it? And I mentioned that we ask you to send it to us and we will put it in the database. However, the client has control over how much of that can be released to other alumni. So what sometimes happens is if there is a project, and there's a couple this round, the MBA admissions project is an example, they are not keen on having a lot of their operations splayed out into public. So what will happen with that project is you will do your work, you will come up with a recommendation, and we will then create a cleansed version of your output that in whatever aspects of it, we hope there will be parts of it that will be something that can be shared, and we'll make sure it's okay with them, and then that would be what is available to people that are outside the team. But there's a confidentiality in all these projects, and usually there are things that organizations don't mind being shared, but every now and then there is a reason that something seems too private. And so we deal with that, and they have a checkoff on their application where they can choose whether they want everything to be available, a limited amount, or nothing, and when we respect their requests. So I just want to have a hand for our panel.